I never used to lock my windows. Living in a quiet neighborhood, I had grown accustomed to feeling safe, even a little too safe. My apartment sat on the third floor of an old, worn-out building, tucked away in the corner of a complex where everyone knew each other's business. It felt like nothing bad could ever happen in a place like this, surrounded by people who'd nod in the hallway and wave from across the street. That all changed one night in late October. It started as a typical evening. The air outside was crisp, and the wind howled softly, sending leaves scurrying down the road. I had curled up on my couch after dinner, flicking through channels on the TV, letting the sound of the news anchor's voice wash over me. Everything was so normal, so routine. But then, in the quiet lull between the commercials, I heard it. A soft click. It was so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. I muted the TV and sat there, straining to hear. Another click, followed by the subtle creak of a door. My heart stopped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I was sure I had locked the door. Slowly, I stood up, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the thudding of my pulse in my ears. Was someone inside? I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but something stopped me. The eerie quiet that had settled over the apartment sent a shiver down my spine. I walked cautiously towards the hallway, my fingers trembling as I gripped the phone. That's when I saw it. The bathroom door, which I always kept closed, was now slightly ajar. I could see just enough of the inside to make out the shadow of something, or someone, moving. My stomach churned, and my blood ran cold. This wasn't a dream. Someone had let themselves into my home. I should have run. I should have screamed or called for help, but instead, I stood there, frozen, staring at the sliver of darkness behind that door. Slowly, as if sensing my presence, the door creaked open further. My breath hitched as a figure emerged, tall, dressed entirely in black, with their face hidden by a hood. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, staring at me from the shadows. For a second, I thought I was going to pass out. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. I managed to stumble back a step, and in a hoarse whisper, I choked out, "What do you want?" The figure said nothing. It felt like hours passed in that silence. My whole body was trembling, adrenaline surging through me, but I couldn't make sense of what was happening. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked back into the bathroom. I heard the faintest rustle, then nothing. Just the creak of the floorboards and the sound of my panicked breathing filling the room. I wanted to believe it was over, but I wasn't sure. Was this person still hiding? Or had they left? My mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. I eventually mustered the courage to bolt to my front door, slamming it shut and locking it tight. I didn't sleep that night. When morning finally came, I called the police. They arrived and searched every inch of the apartment. The window in my bathroom was wide open. They told me the intruder had likely scaled the building from the fire escape. He could have been watching me for days, knowing my routines, waiting for the right moment. They checked for prints, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew. I could still feel his presence, lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced out the window or down the street, I swore I saw movement, but it was always just out of sight. I bought new locks, installed cameras, and even put up bars on the windows. None of it helped. I could feel him just outside, waiting. The worst part was he didn't take anything. There was no sign of a robbery, no valuables missing. The police chalked it up to a freak incident, a would-be thief who got scared off. But I knew it was something more. He hadn't come to steal. He came to let me know he could get in whenever he wanted. He had been inside my home, watched me, and then vanished without a trace. The months passed, but the fear didn't. Every little noise in the night sent my heart racing. A creak of the floorboards, a gust of wind against the windows, even the ticking of the clock in the hall. All of it sounded too loud, too real. I barely slept, waking up at the slightest sound, convinced I'd see him again, standing in the shadows, waiting. Then one night, as I lay in bed, exhausted from weeks of paranoia, I heard it again. The click of the window latch. I bolted upright, staring at the darkness of my room. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. Slowly, the window slid open, the wind rushing in like a cold breath. I didn't move. I couldn't. And there, framed in the moonlight, was the same dark figure, standing just beyond the window, his face still hidden beneath that black hood. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just watching, as if waiting for something. I reached for my phone, but my hands trembled too much to dial. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And just like before, he turned and disappeared into the night. That was the last time I saw him, but I know he's still out there watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Now, every night I lie in bed, wide awake, listening for the sound of that window latch, knowing that someday he'll come back for more than just a glimpse. The silent caller. It started with a phone call, a simple ring in the dead of night. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., waking me from a deep sleep. Groggy and annoyed, I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the screen to see a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" My voice cracked from sleep. Nothing. Just silence on the other end. I waited a few seconds, confused, listening for any background noise, but there was nothing. No breathing, no static, just complete, eerie silence. After a few moments, I hung up and dismissed it as a prank. People had nothing better to do, apparently, but the calls kept coming. The next night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the phone rang again. Same unknown number. This time, a cold chill ran down my spine. I let it ring twice, staring at the screen, feeling my heart pound in my chest. Against my better judgment, I answered again. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound firm but feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Again, nothing. The same oppressive silence. This time I didn't wait as long. I hung up and blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next night, the phone rang again, 2:17 a.m. But now it came from a different unknown number. My blood turned cold. I had blocked the other number, so how were they still calling? I stared at the phone in the darkness, dread creeping over me. I didn't answer this time, but the ringing didn't stop. It went on and on, each ring louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the night. After what felt like an eternity, it finally stopped. I thought I could sleep after that, but I was wrong. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, every sound in the apartment felt amplified. The creaks of the old building, the faint ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, all of it set me on edge. I didn't realize how tense I was until the phone rang again. 2:27 a.m. this time. Another unknown number. This wasn't just a prank anymore. It felt personal, like someone was watching, waiting for me to answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the phone, the eerie silence now filling my entire apartment. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. The calls didn't stop after that. Every night at 2:17 a.m. without fail, my phone would ring. Sometimes I'd get 2 or 3 calls in a row, all from different numbers, all with the same crushing silence on the other end. It was like the silence itself was mocking me, daring me to figure out what it wanted. I began losing sleep. The anxiety would build as the clock ticked closer to 2:17, and I'd find myself sitting up in bed, staring at my phone, waiting. Each night, the fear crept in deeper. I started sleeping with the lights on, checking the windows and doors, double and triple locking everything. Then came the night when I made a mistake. I answered. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe I thought I could end it, confront whoever was behind this. Maybe I was just too exhausted to think straight. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., when the phone rang, I picked it up without hesitation. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound strong. At first there was the same silence, but then faintly I heard it. A soft rustling, like someone moving through leaves or fabric brushing against skin. My breath caught in my throat. My hand tightened around the phone. "Hello?" I whispered, fear gripping me like a vice. And then I heard it. A voice, so soft and distorted it was barely audible. It whispered one word, but it chilled me to the bone. "Look." The call ended. I sat there frozen, the word echoing in my mind. Look? Look at what? My eyes darted around the room, every shadow suddenly feeling deeper, every corner darker. I couldn't help but feel watched, like there was someone just out of sight observing my every move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every faint sound felt amplified, like someone was in the room with me. I checked the windows, the doors, but everything was locked. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling that something was terribly wrong lingered. The next night I sat in the dark, staring at the phone, waiting. I knew the call would come, and at exactly 2:17 a.m. it did. But this time, I didn't answer. Instead, I let it ring, my heart racing as I stared at the screen. Then, just as the ringing stopped, a loud bang echoed from the other side of my apartment. I jumped, my heart nearly stopping. It sounded like someone had slammed a door, or worse, entered the apartment. With shaking hands, I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the sound. The hallway felt impossibly long, the shadows darker than usual. As I approached the bathroom, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I reached for the knob, pushing it open slowly. Inside, there was nothing. Everything was as it should be, but the mirror was fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it. And written in the condensation, barely legible, was a single word: "Look." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lamp, my mind racing. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone was still in my apartment. I ran from room to room, searching every corner, every closet, but no one was there. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like eyes were on me at all times, lurking just out of view. The calls continued, but now, every night, there would be more. They didn't stop at 2:17. They would come at 3, 4, until dawn. I couldn't answer them anymore. I knew better. But each time I didn't, something worse would happen. Footsteps in the hallway, lights flickering, objects moving from where I'd left them. My life had become a waking nightmare. One night, I finally decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, booked a hotel, and left the apartment, thinking I could outrun whatever was happening. But when I got to the hotel, my phone rang. It was 2:17 a.m. The wrong turn. It was supposed to be a routine drive, a quick trip to visit my parents in the countryside. I'd taken the route 100 times before, but that night, something was different. The sky was darker than usual, the kind of black that swallowed the stars, and the moon, usually a comforting presence, was hidden behind thick clouds. The GPS on my phone was glitching, losing signal more often than not, and as I reached a familiar intersection, the screen froze completely. "Great," I muttered, pulling off onto the shoulder to fiddle with the phone. After restarting it for the third time, the GPS finally pinged back to life, but the route it was showing me felt off. The road it was suggesting wasn't the usual highway. Instead, it led down an unfamiliar dirt road. I hesitated. I knew the countryside well, or at least I thought I did. I'd never seen this road before, but the GPS was insisting this was a shortcut. Tired and anxious to reach my destination, I decided to trust the map and turned onto the dirt road, thinking it would save me time. As soon as I made the turn, the atmosphere changed. The trees that lined the road seemed to close in on me, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal hands reaching toward the car. The headlights barely pierced through the thick fog that had started to roll in, making the road ahead seem more like a tunnel into darkness. I rolled down the window slightly, expecting to hear the usual sounds of crickets or the breeze rustling through the leaves, but there was nothing. Just dead, unnatural silence. The road was narrower than I expected, and the deeper I drove, the more uneasy I became. It felt like the trees were watching me, their shadows shifting in ways that didn't quite make sense. Every now and then, I would see movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The road twisted and turned, each bend sharper than the last, and I began to realize I wasn't saving time at all. In fact, I was getting lost. The GPS started acting up again, blinking in and out, and before long, it lost the signal completely. Panic began to bubble in my chest as I considered turning around, but the road had become so narrow, I wasn't sure I could. As I rounded another bend, I spotted something in the road ahead, a figure standing still in the middle of the path. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. My headlights illuminated the figure, but the fog was so thick I could barely make out any details. It was tall, with a long coat that seemed to billow in the wind, though I couldn't feel any breeze. I honked the horn, hoping they would move, but the figure remained still. Unease turned to full-blown fear. I didn't want to get out of the car, but I couldn't drive forward either. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to reverse when the figure began to move. Not forward, not backward, but sideways, into the trees, slipping between them without making a sound, as if it wasn't even walking. I stared, my breath catching, unsure of what I had just seen. I slammed the car into reverse, but as I did, I heard a soft thud against the rear of the car. My blood ran cold. I checked the rearview mirror but saw nothing but the thick fog. I didn't dare get out, but I knew I had to keep moving. Something was wrong, and staying here wasn't an option. I tried to reverse further but felt the car jolt, as if I had hit something behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked back again, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The fog was swirling, thicker now, and for a moment, I thought I saw another figure, crouched low behind the car. It was hunched, too tall to be human, and its shape was unnatural, limbs twisted in impossible angles. Its head turned toward me slowly, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and malevolent. I slammed the car back into drive and lurched forward, my tires skidding on the dirt road. The figure behind me moved faster than anything should, darting from tree to tree, keeping pace with the car. I could hear it now, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, crunching the dirt and twigs beneath it. My heart raced as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, but the road was so winding that I couldn't speed up without risking crashing into a tree. The figure appeared beside me now, just outside the window, but it didn't look like it was running. It glided, its long coat fluttering unnaturally in the still air. I dared not look too closely, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see its face, or rather, the lack of a face. It was smooth, featureless, but its presence was suffocating, like it was pressing against my mind, trying to invade my thoughts. I swerved, barely avoiding a tree as the figure vanished again into the fog. I prayed for the road to open up, to lead me back to somewhere familiar, but instead it seemed to get darker, narrower. The fog thickened until it felt like I was driving through a cloud. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, and the air inside the car grew cold, so cold that my breath started to fog up the windows. Suddenly, the road ended. Out of nowhere, I found myself at the edge of a clearing. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just before the tires slipped into a deep ravine that dropped off into nothingness. The trees around me formed a perfect circle, towering above like sentinels, their branches twisted together, blocking out the sky. The silence was deafening. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to calm my breathing. The ravine before me seemed to stretch endlessly, a black void that swallowed any light. I glanced into the rearview mirror, praying that the figure was gone, but it wasn't. It stood directly behind the car now, closer than ever, its long, twisted limbs scraping against the back window. Its head tilted to one side as it stared at me, faceless, but somehow watching. My skin crawled as I realized I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. The figure stepped closer, its coat dragging on the ground, leaving no footprints. I hit the gas again, hoping to turn around, but the car wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had swallowed the tires, trapping me in place. The figure's hand pressed against the window now, the glass fogging up around its fingers. I screamed, slamming my fists against the steering wheel, trying to wake up from this nightmare. Then, the car door creaked open. The whispers in the attic. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her old house. It was a large, creaky, Victorian-style home that had been in the family for generations, but it had long since fallen into disrepair. Despite its age, I had fond memories of visiting her when I was younger. Back then, the house had been warm, filled with the smell of her cooking and the soft hum of the radio. Now, it was cold, dark, and eerily quiet. I moved in temporarily while sorting through her belongings, planning to sell the property afterward. The first few days were uneventful, though the house always had a strange, oppressive feel to it, as if the very walls were steeped in memories of the past. Still, I figured it was just my imagination, and the uneasiness of being in such an old house alone. The only thing that really bothered me was the attic. I'd never been in the attic as a child. Grandma always kept it locked, saying there was nothing up there but dust and old junk. Now, with the key in hand, I couldn't shake the curiosity gnawing at me. I hadn't had a chance to go up there yet, but every time I walked past the attic door, I felt something strange. It wasn't just the drafty, cold air that seeped from beneath the door. It was the feeling that something was up there, waiting. It wasn't long before the noises started. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, or maybe some raccoons scurrying around the roof. But the sounds were too deliberate. At night, when the rest of the house was still, I would hear it, the faintest creaking, like footsteps, coming from directly above me in the attic. I tried to ignore it, but the more I pretended it wasn't there, the louder it seemed to get. One evening, as I sat in the living room trying to relax, the sound came again. A soft thud, followed by a long, drawn-out creak. It was as if someone, or something, was walking back and forth above me. My skin prickled with unease. I grabbed a flashlight and decided it was time to investigate. The attic door groaned as I unlocked it, the key sticking in the old rusty lock. The narrow staircase leading up was cloaked in darkness, the beam from my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. As I ascended, the air grew heavier, colder, and with each step, the strange sensation of being watched intensified. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a dusty, cluttered room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, stacks of boxes and cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. I stood still, listening. Nothing. The creaking, the thuds, it was all gone. I exhaled in relief, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I took a quick glance around the attic, seeing nothing out of the ordinary, and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A whisper. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The sound was so faint, like someone murmuring just beneath their breath. I spun around, shining the flashlight through the attic, but I was alone. The whisper came again, this time more distinct, as if it was calling to me. It seemed to come from the far corner where the shadows were thickest. My heart raced as I stepped closer, trying to make out what was being said. The whispering grew louder, but the words were garbled, like a dozen voices speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. My throat tightened, and my hands shook as I lifted the flashlight higher. There, in the far corner, I saw it. An old, battered trunk. Unlike everything else in the attic, it wasn't covered in dust. It looked recently used. With trembling fingers, I knelt in front of the trunk. The whispers surrounded me now, louder, almost urgent, as if they were pleading with me. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct told me to leave, to go back downstairs and forget about the attic. But something compelled me. The same curiosity that had driven me to open the attic door in the first place. I unlatched the trunk. Inside, there were old family photos, yellowed letters, and trinkets from my grandmother's past. But buried beneath them at the very bottom was something I didn't expect. A small antique doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its glassy eyes stared up at me, lifeless, but somehow filled with a malevolent energy. I recoiled, a cold chill running down my spine. As soon as I touched the doll, the whispers turned into screams. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The attic felt alive, like the walls were closing in, and the voices. They were all around me now, shouting, screaming, demanding. I stumbled back, dropping the doll to the floor, but the moment it hit the wood, the entire attic shook violently. Panicked, I turned to flee, but the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my ears as I grabbed the doorknob, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, softer now, but more sinister, like they were inside my head. My vision blurred as the room seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker, denser, until they weren't shadows at all. They were figures. They emerged from the corners, their forms twisted and misshapen, barely visible in the flickering light of my dying flashlight. One by one, they began to move towards me, slow and deliberate, their movements unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by unseen strings. I backed up against the wall, my mind racing, but there was no escape. As the figures closed in, I heard a voice, clear and distinct among the whispers. It was my grandmother's voice, soft and soothing, but with an edge of desperation. "Don't let them take you!" Before I could react, the door burst open behind me and I fell backward down the stairs, hitting the floor below with a hard thud. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet and slammed the attic door shut. The noises stopped. The whispers were gone. I never went back into that attic. After that night, I left the house unable to stay another minute. I don't know what I unleashed by opening that trunk, but I do know one thing. The attic wasn't empty. It had never been empty. The whispers, the figures, they had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to let them out. And now they're free. When I was a child, there was a small patch of woods behind my house where I used to play. It wasn't much, just a few trees, some overgrown bushes, and a crumbling stone wall that had long since been forgotten. The forest was quiet, peaceful, a perfect escape for an imaginative kid like me. My parents had warned me to stay close to the house, but I never listened. I loved exploring the woods, pretending I was on an adventure in a magical land. One day, while wandering deeper into the forest than I ever had before, I stumbled upon something strange, an old graveyard. The headstones were worn and cracked, some leaning precariously to one side, others buried halfway in the earth. Most of the names were unreadable, the inscriptions eroded by time and weather. I had never seen it before, and when I told my parents about it, they shrugged it off, saying the graveyard had probably been there for centuries. I was fascinated by it, though. The idea of an ancient, forgotten burial ground right behind my house gave me chills, but in a way that thrilled me. I started visiting the graveyard often. I don't know why. There was something about it that drew me in. It wasn't spooky, at least not at first. The air there felt still, heavy, as if time itself had slowed down, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It just felt forgotten. That was until I noticed something strange. At first, it was little things. A headstone that hadn't been there the day before. A patch of earth that seemed freshly dug, though no one ever came to the graveyard. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just imagining things. But then the unease started to settle in. Every time I visited, I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, even in the heat of summer, and the silence of the graveyard became oppressive. One day I saw her. It was dusk, and I had stayed later than usual, sitting by one of the old headstones, tracing my fingers over the unreadable engraving. As the light faded, I stood to leave, but out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. There, at the edge of the graveyard, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. A woman, dressed in a long tattered dress, her hair wild and tangled. She stood perfectly still, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. Something about her felt wrong. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, staring. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the soft earth as I raced back through the woods toward home. I didn't look back, too terrified to see if she was following me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, standing at the edge of the graveyard, watching, waiting. The next morning, I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that my imagination had gotten the best of me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. I stayed away from the graveyard for a few days, but the pull was too strong. I had to go back. When I returned, the graveyard felt different. The air was colder, the silence even more suffocating than before. As I made my way to the old headstone where I had last seen the woman, I noticed something new, a fresh grave. The earth was freshly turned, the mound of dirt still soft, but there was no headstone, no marker. Just an unmarked grave in the middle of the forgotten cemetery. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I backed away, my heart racing. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A movement near the trees. She was there again. This time, she was closer, her gaunt face visible in the fading light. Her eyes, dark, empty, hollow, bored into me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her lips parted and she whispered something, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a plea, like she was begging for something. My feet finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken headstone. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Help me!" The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was an edge to it, something dark lurking beneath the surface. I ran, faster than I ever had, not stopping until I reached the safety of my house. That night, I dreamed of the graveyard. In my dream, the woman was standing by the fresh grave, her face twisted in agony, her hands clawing at the dirt. I watched, frozen in place, as she dug, her fingers tearing through the earth until they were raw and bloody. When she looked up at me, her eyes were filled with rage, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't go back to the graveyard, but something inside me felt unfinished, like I had opened a door to something I couldn't close. A few days later, I couldn't resist. I ventured back, my stomach churning with dread. The graveyard looked as it always had, overgrown, forgotten, lifeless. But when I approached the fresh grave, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was open. The earth had been disturbed, the mound of dirt scattered, as if someone, or something, had clawed their way out. The woman was nowhere to be seen. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, not daring to look back. But as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it. A soft, familiar whisper carried on the wind. "Help me." I never returned to the graveyard after that day, but sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. It comes in the stillness, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long. Help me. I've tried to block it out, but I know the truth. She's out there, waiting. And someday, I fear she'll come for me. I'd always been fascinated by old things. Antique shops, flea markets, second-hand stores, you name it, I was there. Something about the stories behind these forgotten objects intrigued me. So when I stumbled upon the old clockmaker's shop on the edge of town, I couldn't resist going inside. The shop was like something out of a dream, dimly lit, with the ticking of clocks echoing through the air like the heartbeat of the place. The walls were lined with clocks of every size and shape. Grandfathers, pocket watches, cuckoos, and some that looked so old they must have been from another century. The shop smelled of dust and wood polish, and the light was filtered through heavy, moth-eaten curtains. There was an odd stillness in the air, as though time itself had slowed down in that place. Behind the counter sat the clockmaker. He was a frail, ancient man, his skin pale and thin, almost translucent. He didn't say a word when I entered, just watched me with hollow, sunken eyes as I browsed the collection of clocks. It was unsettling, but I was too absorbed in the beauty of the clocks to care much. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, tucked away on a dusty shelf, was a small, ornate clock unlike any I'd ever seen. Its face was cracked, the hands frozen at midnight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with delicate carvings around the edge that seemed to tell a story of their own. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavy, like it was filled with more than just gears and springs. I had to have it. "How much for this one?" I asked, holding it up to the clockmaker. His expression changed for the first time since I entered. A flicker of something that might have been fear passed across his face. He leaned forward, squinting at the clock as though seeing it for the first time. "That one." His voice was a rasp, barely above a whisper. "That clock is cursed. You don't want it." I smiled, thinking he was just trying to up the price with some old superstition. "Cursed? Really?" He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the clock. "That clock belonged to a man who tampered with time. He thought he could control it. But time doesn't like to be controlled." I should have listened to him. I should have left the clock right there and walked out of that shop, but I didn't. I laughed it off and insisted on buying the clock. The clockmaker hesitated but eventually agreed, selling it to me for a ridiculously low price, as if he couldn't wait to get rid of it. I took it home, excited to add it to my collection. I set it on the mantelpiece in my living room, where it fit perfectly among my other antiques. For a few days everything was fine. The clock didn't work, of course, but it was beautiful to look at, and I was happy with my purchase. Then, strange things started happening. At first it was subtle, a sense of déjà vu that I couldn't shake, like I'd lived the same moment before. I would glance at the clock on the mantel and feel an odd, creeping sensation that the hands had moved, even though they were still stuck at midnight. One night, I woke up to the sound of ticking. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and strained to listen. The ticking was coming from the living room, from the clock. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. As I entered the living room, I saw it. The hands of the clock were moving. Slowly, impossibly, they were turning backward. A chill ran down my spine as I watched, frozen in place. The ticking grew louder, faster, the sound filling the room. The hands spun in reverse, faster and faster, until they were a blur. And then, with a loud snap, the clock stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the clock. The hands were back at midnight, unmoving. But the room felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, like a storm was about to break. And then I noticed something even more unsettling. The room wasn't quite right. The furniture was all in the same place, but there were small differences. A picture frame that had been on the coffee table was now on the shelf. The curtains were drawn, though I knew I had left them open. It was like someone, or something, had been in my house while I slept, moving things around. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away from me. I would lose track of hours, finding myself standing in the middle of a room with no memory of how I got there. I started hearing the ticking again, even when the clock wasn't moving. I tried to get rid of it. I threw the clock in the trash, but the next morning it was back on the mantel, as if it had never left. I took it to a pawn shop, but the owner refused to take it, saying it gave him the creeps. No matter what I did, the clock always came back. And then, the dream started. In my dreams, I was trapped in a maze of gears and cogs, the ticking of clocks echoing around me. I would run through endless corridors, searching for a way out, but every path led me back to the same place. The clock, sitting on a pedestal, its hands spinning wildly backward. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the ticking still ringing in my ears. One night, I woke up to find the clock had changed. The face was no longer cracked, and the hands were moving forward, slowly ticking toward midnight. I knew deep down that something terrible would happen when the clock struck 12. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The ticking followed me everywhere, growing louder and louder as the hands crept closer to midnight. I tried to destroy the clock. I smashed it with a hammer, drowned it in water, even set it on fire. But nothing worked. It always reappeared, whole and unscathed. The night it finally reached midnight was the night everything changed. I was sitting in the living room, watching in horror as the hands moved to 12. As the clock struck midnight, the room went silent. The ticking stopped. And then, everything around me began to warp, to twist. The walls bent and stretched. The floor buckled beneath my feet. Time itself seemed to be unraveling, pulling me into a void of darkness. And then, I was somewhere else. I found myself standing in the clockmaker's shop, but it was different now. Dustier, darker, more decayed. The clocks on the walls were shattered, their faces frozen at midnight, and behind the counter stood the clockmaker, his hollow eyes staring into mine. "You should have listened," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty shop. I tried to run, but the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The ticking started again, louder than ever, filling the air with a deafening roar. The clock on the mantelpiece glowed with an eerie light, its hands spinning out of control. And then, with a final sickening click, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the ticking still ringing in my ears. The clock was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. Time had been broken, and I was trapped in its endless loop. Now, every day feels the same. I relive the same moments, over and over, with no way to escape. The clockmaker's curse has bound me to this broken timeline, and no matter how hard I try, I can't break free. The ticking never stops. I'd always heard whispers about the old hollow house on the outskirts of town. For as long as I could remember, people avoided it, saying it was cursed, that something terrible had happened there a long time ago. It was an ancient, decaying mansion, surrounded by overgrown trees and thorny bushes, so isolated it seemed like it didn't belong in this world. Of course, I didn't believe in all that nonsense. Stories, that's all they were. Legends made to scare children. I figured the place had been abandoned so long that it just had that natural, creepy vibe. And being the thrill seeker I was, I couldn't resist the temptation to explore it one night. I convinced a few friends to come with me. We made a plan. Sneak in through the back at midnight, explore for a couple of hours, maybe scare each other a little, and then leave with some great stories to tell. Harmless fun, right? When the night came, we stood outside the gate, staring up at the towering, dilapidated structure. The wind howled, making the trees groan as if they were warning us to stay away. The house itself loomed over us, its windows like empty eyes watching, waiting. Despite the cold air, I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my spine. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. We climbed over the rusted gate and made our way through the tangled undergrowth to the back door. It was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as we pushed it open. The smell of mildew and rot hit us immediately, thick and suffocating, but we pressed on, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the house was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were cracked and peeling, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like lace, and the air was thick with dust. Every step we took echoed through the empty halls, making it feel like the house was alive, listening. We split up to cover more ground. My best friend Jason and I went upstairs, while the others stayed on the main floor. As we climbed the creaky staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway behind us. The second floor was worse than the first. The walls were covered in faded, torn wallpaper, and the doors to each room hung open as if they had been left in a hurry. Jason and I picked a door at random and stepped inside. It was a bedroom, but there was something wrong about it. The bed was still made, as if someone had just left moments before, and a thin layer of dust covered everything except for the mirror on the wall. The mirror was spotless, reflecting our nervous faces with unnatural clarity. My stomach churned as I approached it. Something about it felt wrong, out of place, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "Dude, check this out," Jason whispered, pointing at the corner of the room. In the dim light, I saw what he was pointing at. A large, dusty trunk. It was old, with tarnished brass hinges and a lock that had long since rusted away. My heart raced with excitement. Maybe this was where the previous owners had stashed something valuable before they abandoned the house. Without thinking, I knelt beside the trunk and opened it. Inside were old clothes, tattered and moth-eaten, but beneath them was something else. A stack of yellowed papers tied with a ribbon. I pulled them out, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the first page. It was a letter, dated over a century ago. The handwriting was elegant but frantic, the ink smudged as if written in a hurry. As I read the first few lines, my blood turned to ice. "They're still here," it began. "They never left. We tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let us. It keeps us here, trapped, feeding on us, on our fear. It knows when we're afraid. It listens. It waits. We thought we could escape, but it won't let us go. The house is hollow. Hollow, but alive. Do not stay after dark. Once the sun sets, you will belong to it too." I looked up at Jason, my mouth dry. "What the hell is this?" Jason didn't respond. He was staring at the mirror, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. Slowly, I turned to look. The reflection in the mirror wasn't us. At first glance, it seemed normal, but as I looked closer, I saw that the figures in the mirror weren't quite right. Their movements were delayed, like they were struggling to keep up with us. Their eyes were wrong too. Dark, hollow, as though they were looking right through us. "Jason," I whispered, backing away from the mirror. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. I ran to it, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Jason stood frozen in place, staring at the mirror as the figures inside it began to move. Not with us, but on their own. I heard a soft whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the trunk. I spun around, heart racing, but it was empty. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like a voice coming from the walls themselves, calling my name. My name. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Jason, but he was already walking toward the mirror, his movement stiff and unnatural. I grabbed his arm, but it was cold. Too cold. "Jason!" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the reflection, which now showed only him, or what looked like him. The figure in the mirror was smiling, but it wasn't Jason's smile. It was twisted, sinister, and its eyes gleamed with malice. Then, without warning, it stepped out of the mirror. The thing that looked like Jason grabbed me, its touch freezing, its grip like iron. I screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. It dragged me toward the mirror, where the reflection of the room twisted and warped into something dark, something hungry. I could feel the house closing in on me, the walls shifting, watching, waiting to consume me. I fought with everything I had, but it was useless. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection, standing in the room, looking back at me with hollow, dead eyes. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying in the dirt by the gate. My friends were there too, unconscious but alive. Jason, though, Jason was gone. I tried to tell the police what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said Jason must have run off, that the house was just an old building with no power over us. But I know the truth. The Hollow House took him, just like it took the others before us. And every night, I hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back, telling me that it's not done with me yet. Because once the house knows you, once it's touched you, it never lets you go.